There are only a few public figures in this country who are instantly identifiable by a single name, and one of them is Tommy. Tommy Douglas. He has been Tommy for 40 years. As a prairie preacher, as a member of Parliament, as Premier of Saskatchewan, as a member of Parliament again, and now as he retires from the leadership of the New Democratic Party as a Canadian institution. Few Canadians have been introduced more often at public meetings and conferences and banquets and thousands of other gatherings. And when he's introduced by the chairman, they usually give some biographical details about him, and there's quite a lot to say about Tommy Douglas. He was born in Scotland, the son of an ironmonger, came to Canada at the age of 14, lived in Winnipeg at the time of the general strike, which certainly had an effect on his social outlook. At university, Brandon College, McMaster, University of Chicago, he was a brilliant debater, a gold medalist. I'm certain his sermons were a delight. He was ordained in the Baptist Church. His first call was to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, but he's been a politician for 36 years. He was first elected to the House of Commons in 1935, re-elected in 1939, and after he resigned to accept the leadership of the Saskatchewan CCF, he won in 1944, as almost everybody knows, a smashing victory. He was premier for 16 years until he accepted the leadership of the New Democratic Party in 1961 and re-entered the House of Commons. Quite a career. Chairmen love to dwell on it when introducing him, and they usually sprinkle their introductions with laudatory remarks. Tommy reacts to such introductions with modesty, persistently wondering with some humor what the fuss is all about. Here he is at the beginning of an important address to delegates to a meeting of the Cooperative League of the United States.
May I thank you for your very fine demonstration of welcome. May I thank you, sir, for your very kind words of introduction. Being a politician, I don't always get such laudatory introductions. I get introductions of all sorts and descriptions. I think my strangest introduction, however, was once going to a theological college where I was to be the guest speaker at the graduation dinner of these young clergymen. And I was introduced by one of the young theologians. And he got up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "it is my privilege this evening to introduce the Premier of the province." He said, "This would make some people nervous, but it doesn't bother me at all." He said, "For several years now, I've been helping to run a church camp for boys and girls. One summer, we had a little boy come to camp whose name was Peter. Peter got along fine at the camp until one night for supper they had prunes. Peter didn't like prunes, so he wouldn't eat them. Lady in charge came around and said, 'Peter, eat those prunes.' 'No, don't like them.' 'Peter,' she said, 'eat those prunes or God is going to punish you.' Well, that was different. Peter started to eat the prunes. And he ate the prunes until he got down to the last one. He just couldn't take any more. Punishment or no punishment, he'd had it, so he quit. Lady came back, she said, 'Peter, eat that prune.' 'No.' Well, she said, 'Peter, we're going to leave that saucer there and you'll be glad to eat it.' After supper, the children played ball. Later on, they went off to bed. During the night, one of those storms that we get on the prairies came up. Thunder rumbled, the lightning flashed, the wind shook the old building, the rain came down in torrents. Children were terrified. They huddled together in the center of the dormitory floor. Those in charge came in, quietened them down, got everybody back in bed. Everybody tucked in, except one. Peter's bed was empty. Lady in charge said, 'I think I know where he is.' Down to the dining room she went, turned on the light. Here was Peter sitting up at the table eating this prune. He looked up at her with these big blue innocent eyes and he said, 'Say, that was a hell of a fuss about one little prune, wasn't it?'"
Tommy Douglas is an orator in the old-fashioned tradition. He believes that speech is the most important instrument any politician has to communicate, to educate, and to convince. A typical Douglas speech lasts about an hour, and it's followed by a question-and-answer period. It always begins with a smattering of funny stories to put the audience at ease and make them receptive. And then Tommy moves directly into one or more of the major issues of the day: the state of the economy, inflation, unemployment, Medicare, social planning, foreign ownership, youth, technology, change. He'll choose one or two or three of those topics, depending on who the audience is and where he's speaking, and what the front pages say that day. And you'll notice that he never misses an opportunity to speak about the future, of a better day and a better world, and that he always challenges people to act, to decide what they want, and to select the men and the parties who don't manipulate people but who serve them. Policies with him are always secondary to people and their needs. In 1945, a year after taking office, Tommy Douglas broadcast an important speech in opposition to an application by vested interests to disallow some of his government's legislation in Saskatchewan. The CPR, the insurance companies, the mortgage companies wanted Ottawa to veto 3 new laws which proposed to tax mineral rights when they were held for speculation, which protected farmers being crushed by heavy mortgage debts, and which gave further protection to municipalities still struggling under the burden of Depression-year debt. In this speech, Tommy Douglas fights for the principle that the people are free to determine policies which deal with their problems. And under the kind of attack that you're about to hear, the federal government refused to entertain the petition by the vested interests to veto the provincial legislation. Tommy concluded his broadcast in this way.
Let me here issue a word of warning to those who are moving heaven and earth to have this legislation disallowed. I want to tell them that they're not dealing in this case with a government of tired old men who are merely holding on to power for the spoils of office or with the hope of finding a final resting place in the Senate. They're dealing with a government fresh from the people, with a mandate to carry out the people's wishes. Those wishes will be carried out. If these vested interests succeed in persuading the federal government to disallow this legislation, we still have other resources at our disposal, and we will not hesitate to use them. We were elected to protect the homes and the security of our people, and we will use every legitimate method which we possess to attain that end. These governments who want the present legislation destroyed may well find that what will take its place will be even less palatable than that to which they now object. If they insist on this arbitrary and high-handed method, they may find that what they get will be even worse than what they have now. My object in speaking to you tonight is to let you know that the government is not prepared to retreat one single inch. The one thing we must know, however, is that the people of this province are behind us in our determination to fight this invasion of our democratic rights by the financial barons. The legislation in question has not yet been disallowed. We still have 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which to write your members of parliament. 3 weeks in which to send resolutions from municipal councils, city councils, and various farmers, labor, and businessmen's organizations. We have 3 weeks in which to let the federal government know that the people of Saskatchewan will not take lying down this despotic interference with democratic government. This is no time for fair weather friends and sunshine soldiers. This is a time for men and women of all political parties, races, and creeds to stand shoulder to shoulder in defense of their democratic right to elect governments to do their will without interference from any corporation, no matter how large or how powerful. In the past few years, a conviction has been growing that governments are always on the side of concentrated wealth and against the common man. This belief has not been without some foundation. The time has come for Saskatchewan to express itself vigorously and vehemently against such a negation of democracy. We are prepared to lead that fight if you are prepared to follow us into battle. The Saskatchewan government was elected by the people of this province. We were not elected to protect the interests of special privilege. We were not elected to become puppets of those who sit in high places and pull the strings. We were elected to give our people security in their homes, to give them reliable protection in their dealings with powerful corporations. And we were elected to see to it that those same corporations should make some financial contribution to a higher standard of social services. Our objectives have not changed. We are still determined to do the things we were elected to do. We are neither surprised nor dismayed by the attempts of these powerful interests to resist progressive change. The fight to preserve democracy across the sea has just finished. The fight to make democracy a reality at home is just beginning.
That was a speech dealing with a local issue, but now we are going to hear Tommy Douglas leave this narrow base and move on to a broader one, speaking here not just as a citizen of Saskatchewan or even of Canada, but as a citizen of the world. During his years as Premier, he made countless speeches to teachers, and this is a pretty typical excerpt from one of them.
I think that in our democracy, education must be concerned with the formation of character. Because in the final analysis, democracy depends on human character. You cannot have a democracy that functions if the great mass of the people don't believe in honest and efficient government. If they don't believe that the welfare of the community ought to take precedence over the welfare of any individual or any special group of individuals. And that will only come about when you have men and women who have a sense of value, who believe in honesty and truth and loyalty, who have an appreciation of beauty, who have a fundamental belief in the spiritual nature of the universe in which we live. Now, primarily, of course, that's the function of the church. Certainly also the function of the home. But it cannot be lost sight of in the school. There is very little use of the church teaching the child that he is a spiritual being, of the parents teaching the child that he has a certain moral responsibility, if those who are imparting knowledge to the child leave him the idea that moral and spiritual values are unimportant. If democracy is to survive and to succeed, we have to produce boys and girls who think in terms of this great world picture, who are concerned about the welfare of people the wide world over, whose minds are not limited to their own community or just to people with the same colors of skin and who speak the same language as they do. Because the next generation will have to think in global terms. We'll have to think in terms of sharing the abundance we have with those who have not, if the world is to be saved from the horror of an atomic war in this or in coming generations. That's the task we have, those of us who are shaping the lives of the citizens of tomorrow. That in the final analysis, while we do like to have monetary returns and while we like to have the comforts and amenities of life, the happiest people I have ever known are the people who took their satisfaction in intangible things, in the knowledge of the work they have done, in the consciousness of the contribution they have made to their day and generation, in the firm faith that they have left behind them something better because they've been there. Yours is a great profession. It brings great returns in terms of satisfaction. The poet may work with his imperishable lines, the artist with his paint and canvas, the sculptor with his marble. But all of these will eventually vanish away. But to you has been given the shaping of the world of tomorrow, the molding of the lives and personalities and the characters of the men and the women who will guide the destiny of this nation and of the world in the years that lie ahead. It's a great responsibility. It's a great challenge. But I'm sure that it's also a great source of satisfaction. I took a piece of plastic clay and idly fashioned it one day. And as my fingers pressed it still, it moved and yielded to my will. I came again when days were past, and that bit of clay was hard at last. It's still that early imprint bore. I could change its form no more. I took a piece of living clay and gently shaped it day by day. I molded it with power and art, a young child's soft and yielding heart. I came again when years were gone. He was a man I looked upon. He's still that early impress boy. And I could change him nevermore.
Now we're going to hear some Douglas jokes. You know, he constantly sprinkles his speeches with anecdotes of all kinds. These are generally drawn from the folklore and immediate experience of his audience, and he uses them in two ways. First, simply to entertain, as the next band suggests, and secondly, to make a point, as you will hear a little later on this record.
I'm something like the old farmer and his wife who had a daughter who went off to the city, and she got herself a job and did very well and fell in love with a nice young boy, and she was thinking of getting married, and she wrote home and said to Mother and Dad, "Now, Mother and Dad," she said, I'm going to bring George home so you can meet him, and I hope you like him because I want to marry him." And she brought him home, and of course she told Father and Mother to be on the best behavior, and they were doing so. They had coffee in the living room. Then Mother said, "Now, Father," she said, "you take George and Mary and show them over the farm while I get dinner ready." So away Father went, and he was showing them over the place. George, of course, was trying to make a good impression, too. He was praising everything he saw, what lovely stock, what fine buildings, what magnificent machinery. And when he got down to the garden, he said, "Why," he said, "Mr. Brown, I've never seen such big strawberries." Oh, the farmer was very modest. He said, "Nothing to that. Anybody can grow strawberries. Lots of manure. Put manure on them." He said, "Why, what a wonderful hedge you got." "Oh," he said, "lots of manure." "What big vegetable garden." "Oh," he said, "lots of manure." That's the answer. The girl was getting more and more embarrassed, and presently she left the father and the boyfriend, and up to the house she came, and she said, "Mother," said, "you've got to do something with Father." Mother said, "What's wrong now, Mary?" "Well," she said, "he's down there with George in the garden talking about manure." Said, "Mother, can't you teach him to say fertilizer?" Mother said, "Mary, it's taken me 25 years to get him to say manure." We're sorry that we've given you so much hot weather. This you can expect here. This is the country of drought and heat. They tell, you know, of the politician, one of those kind of politicians who'd rather be wrong than be quiet, who was making a speech in which he said, "Why, this is a fine province. There's nothing wrong with this province. All this province needs is lots of water and lots of good people." Some fellow at the back said, "That's all hell needs." The farmer who's hauling water and one of these to feed his stock, and one of these tourists going through said, "What are you hauling water for?" He said, I'm hauling it to my stock. He said, how far do you haul it? He said, 2 miles. He said, why don't you put down a well? Well, he said, about the same distance.
Tommy Douglas is a Burns enthusiast. In fact, he's more than that. He's a scholar of Robert Burns's work. He's committed great chunks of Burns' poetry to memory, and he's read just about everything there is to read about the poet. Why Robbie Burns? Well, after all, Tommy Douglas is a Scot, and Burns wrote about the ordinary people. Like Douglas, Burns takes his illustrations and subjects from everyday activity. He's a champion of the rights of the common man. He sings of freedom. He lived in a great period of social revolution, and he wrote about it. As Tommy himself has said, if today we have a better understanding of the dignity of man, if we believe in the worth of the common man, we owe much to the inspiration of Burns. But what appeals to him as well is Burns' humanity, his sensitivity, his great capacity for affection. The excerpts which you're going to hear, read by Tommy Douglas, deal with love and affection, as in the poems called Of A' the Airts the Wind Can Blaw, and social and political justice, as in Man Was Made to Mourn.
One of the songs he wrote, which isn't so well known, is a song he wrote for his wife, Jean Armour. After Jean and he were married at Mauchline, he went to Ellisland, start a new life on a new farm. He had to build a home for her. So he was separated from his wife for many months. He was very lonely. And he wrote a little song for her. As you know, Burns was not an easy man to live with. Jean Armour had many heartaches. Yet, when one recalls that she survived him by some 50 years, I often think that as she sat by the fireside at night and sang some of his songs which were written for her, she must have felt that all her heartaches were worthwhile. To have had such beautiful songs dedicated to the woman he loved. And there in Ellisland he wrote what I think is his loveliest song. Of all the airts the winds can blow, I dearly love the west. For there the bonny lassie lives, the lassie I love best. There wild woods grow and rivers flow, and many a hill between. But day and night my fancy's flight is ever wi' my Jean. I see her in the dewy flowers. I see her fresh and fair. I hear her in the tuneful birds. I hear her charm the air. There's not a bonny flower that springs by fountain, shaw, or green. There's not a bonny bird that sings, but minds me of my Jean. He challenged the whole class structure of his day. What I think is one of his greatest poems, Man Was Made to Mourn. He said, see yonder poor o'er-labored wight, so abject, mean, and vile, who begs his brother of the earth to give him leave to toil. And see his lordly fellow worm, his poor petition spurn, unmindful that a weeping wife and helpless offspring mourn. If I'm designed yon lordling slave, by nature's law designed, why was an independent wish e'er planted in my mind? If not, why am I subject to his cruelty and scorn? And why has any man the right to make his fellows mourn?
The CCF held its final convention at the Hotel Saskatchewan in August 1960. The following year, the new Democratic Party was born out of an alliance with the Canadian Labour Congress and Democratic Socialists. Tommy Douglas, who was to lead the new party, gave the introductory speech at the convention banquet, and in it he discussed the changes that had occurred since the CCF was formed in 1933. And he also made an inventory of the party's accomplishments, asked if a socialist party was still necessary, and analyzed the moral and spiritual weaknesses of the affluent society.
We must think in new terms to meet the conditions and the problems of the time in which we live. I'm delighted to see the number of young people here tonight. There's little use in you and me and those of us who attended the 1933 convention telling them about the Depression and the situation of that time. You might just as well tell them about the Napoleonic Wars. What they want to know is, what have you to offer for the problems of today and for the world in which they live? Let me remind you that Canadian society has changed very remarkably since 1933. When we met in this city, we were in the depths of a depression. A completely unplanned, laissez-faire capitalism had completely failed to meet an economic crisis. We had 1 million unemployed, with people riding the rods. We had farmers without enough to eat and livestock dying for the lack of feed. We had an abundance of almost all the things we needed for a good life, and yet people hungry. As Roosevelt said, ill-fed, ill-housed, and ill-clad. That was the situation in which we met at that time. But we must face the fact that that situation has changed radically. I say this because we must recognize that the situation has changed. No longer unplanned laissez-faire capitalism. No longer a society which says every man for himself and the devil take the hindpipe. But today, a measure of managed capitalism with built-in Keynesian techniques by which they can prevent major economic depression and runaway boom, with a built-in welfare state, either large or small, that can be expanded according to the need for purchasing power. That we face today a different situation from what our forefathers faced. Therefore, we have to, like socialist parties all over the world, ask ourselves some very searching questions. And I'm asking you to think about them seriously. This is not a time for demagoguery. This is not a time for beating the drums. This is a time for serious soul searching. With this changed situation in a quarter of a century, with a managed capitalism and a partial welfare state, and in a few years maybe a complete welfare state, is a socialist party any longer necessary? Have we any reason for existence? Have all the battles been won? Are there no mountains left to conquer? This we have to ask ourselves. So I say to you that this affluent society today needs a socialist party because, in my opinion, democratic socialism is still man's best hope. I think that people produce better, people do better, people work better when they are participating through free courts, free exchange of opinion, a free press, the free right to organize, free trade unions, free cooperatives, free political parties. That out of that kind of participation, out of the ferment of discussion, out of the conflict of ideas, out of the exchanges of point of view, you emerge with a better society, not a poorer one. That is why, if we are to have socialism in the world, it must be democratic socialism. Because planning is not an end in itself. Nationalization is not an end in itself.
They're simply part of a democratic process by which people want to exercise some control over their own economic destiny.
Here's a typical Douglas anecdote that not only entertains, but also makes a point. It's called the Cream Separator, and Tommy Douglas uses it to show the inequitable distribution of income, of how easily people can become the victims of a worn-out economic system.
I used to visit and farm homes, particularly around mealtime. And if I got in around dinner time, of course, everybody in the family was busy. They were unhitching the horses. They were pumping water. They were milking the cows. They were pitching down the hay and the oat sheaves. Somebody else was out gathering the eggs. Somebody else was feeding the pigs and the chickens. Everybody had something to do. Even the youngsters were given the job doing something such as gathering eggs or feeding the chickens. And here I was, right off the city street, you know. I didn't know what to do. I'd say, well, give me something to do. Well, nobody was going to trust this city boy with milking a good cow. They gave me the one job, you know, that anybody could do. They gave me the job of turning the handle on the old cream separator. Any of you ever turned the handle on the cream separator? Well, you know, it's quite an experience. I got to be pretty good at it. I got to the place where I could tell you how many verses of Onward Christian Soldiers it takes to put a pan of milk through this thing. And as I was turning the handle, and they were pouring in the milk, and I could see the cream coming out of one spout and the skim milk coming out of the other spout, one day it finally penetrated my thick Scotch head that this cream separator is exactly like our economic system. Here are the primary producers, the farmers and the fishermen and the loggers. They're pouring in the milk. And here are the workers. Whether they work on the railroad or go down to the mines or sail ships or work in a store or a bank or teach school, clerk in the store, work in a hospital, they're the people whose services make the economy go round, and they're turning the handle. So here you have it. Primary producer puts in the milk. People who work with hand and brain turn the handle. And then I thought, but there's another fellow here somewhere. There's a fellow who owns this cream separator. And he's sitting on a stool with the cream spout in his mouth. And the primary producer and the worker, they take turns on the skim milk spout. And they don't like skim milk. Nobody likes skim milk. And they blame it on each other. And the worker says, if those farmers and fishermen, you know, would work a little harder, well, I wouldn't be drinking this skim milk. And the fishermen and the farmers say, if those workers didn't demand a 40-hour week, didn't want such high wages, I wouldn't have to live on this blue milk. But you know, they're both wrong. The farmers and the fishermen have produced so much that we don't know what to do with it. We've got surpluses of foodstuffs. And the workers, they've produced so well that today nearly 500,000 of them are unemployed. The fault isn't with the worker, it isn't with the primary producer. The fault is with this machine. This machine was built to give skim milk to the worker and the primary producer, and to give cream to the corporate elite. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't always do that. Because every once in a while, this little fellow sitting on the stool with the cream spout in his mouth gets indigestion. And he says, boys, stop the machine, we got a recession. He says to the worker, you're laid off, you can go on unemployment insurance. And after that on welfare. And he says to the farmers and the fishermen, you know, we don't need your stuff, take it back home. Then he sits for a while. Indigestion gets better. He burps a couple of times. Says, all right, boys, start the machine. Happy days are here again. Cream for me and skim milk for both of you. Now, what the Democratic Socialist Party have been saying to Canadians for a long time is that the time has come in this land of ours for the worker and the primary producer to get their hands on the regulator of the machine so that it begins to produce homogenized milk in which everybody will get a little cream.
Tommy Douglas spoke at every convention of the Canadian Labour Congress. He was always happy at these gatherings because, of course, he felt a close affinity with the trade union movement, and naturally, the NDP is closely allied to it. He used these occasions to direct the labour movement closely into the political stream of Canadian affairs. He insisted that the movement must change and take on the challenge of the political arena. Here are two excerpts from convention speeches, one in 1968 and another in 1970, dealing with the need for new directions and with the burning question of foreign ownership.
The second thing that needs to be adapted to change is the role of the trade union movement. For more than half a century, the role of the trade union movement in this country has been to improve the lot of the workers, to get better wages, better working conditions, better hours, to establish the right of collective bargaining and to get better agreements. The workers of this country, whether they're in the trade union movement or not, are deeply indebted to you for what you have done to improve the living standards of the people who earn their bread by the sweat of their brow. And that task still has to be continued. But I am here this afternoon to suggest that there is another role in which the trade union movement must play its part. And that is a political role. We have now reached a time in our history when the trade union movement cannot afford to be unconcerned about who sits in the lawmaking bodies of our land. Why? Because with a stroke of a pen, those who have their hands on the levers of power can wipe out in a few days all the gains that you have made at the bargaining table and on the picket line. The third long-term program must be to, as I said earlier, to provide for greater Canadian control of the Canadian economy. Our economy has become so intertwined with the United States that every time the Americans get a cold, we sneeze. Much of our inflation is imported from the United States because that country is spending $30 billion a year in a war in Southeast Asia. We must be able to control our own economy. And I don't mean by that we shouldn't trade with the United States or with anybody else. But the economic decision-making power has to be vested in Canada. This is why we want greater Canadian control of our economy. It's also why we want a Canada Development Corporation, so that the Canadian people can mobilize their savings in pension funds and insurance funds and in mutual funds and use
their accumulated savings to develop more of our resources by Canadians for the benefit of Canadians.
On February 13th, 1971, in Brandon, Manitoba, Tommy Douglas spoke at a dinner in his honor. In this speech, he deals with the overall philosophy of the NDP and its predecessor, the CCF, the movements that he has led first in Saskatchewan and later in Ottawa for so many years. He sees three components in this movement: one ethical, one socialist, one democratic. The excerpts we are to hear deal only with the socialist and the democratic components, and it ends with an exhortation to build the new day.
The second component of this party was a socialist component. That is, we believe that the economy wasn't made for man. Man was made for the economy in this society of ours. We didn't believe that. We believed that the economy should exist to supply human needs, to improve human well-being, and to increase the quality of life and enhance human happiness. We believe that the chief end of our society was not just the making of profits, that the measure of our society wasn't the size of our gold reserve or the extent of our international reserves, that the real measure of our society was what it did in terms of human happiness. What it did in terms of providing that every child would have enough to eat, that every family would have a decent home, that every young person would have an opportunity to acquire an education and to secure meaningful work, and that every old person would have in their declining years security so that they could sit every one beneath his own fig tree. And the final component of this social democratic party is democratic. Ethical, socialist, democratic. Socialism is only socialism if it's democratic socialism, in my opinion. First of all, because whenever men seek to seize power by force, history proves that they have to retain power by force, which means that they must impose a police state upon people. And what's even more significant is that every time they want to change leadership or change direction in that society, they have to make the change by force. And so you end up with a society which is a police state disturbed periodically by bloody purges. When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not just thinking only of how we get into office. I'm thinking of also the kind of government we have after we get into office. Because socialism, if it's to mean anything, has to be democratic in practice as well as in acquiring power. I don't want to see a society in which everything is taken over by the state, because I don't want to trade one form of tyranny for another. I want to see some parts of our society, of course, have to be run by the state where they are monopolies.
and run by the people through their elected representatives. But there are whole areas of our society that can be run by the people themselves. I want to see cooperatives. I look forward to the day, I may not live to see it, but it will come, when the farmers of this country will own and control the processing of their own products. Instead of getting, as they get now, only 39 cents out of every consumer's dollar that's spent on food. I look forward to the day when the farmers will own and control their own industries for manufacturing farm machinery and chemicals and their other requirements. I look forward to the day when trade unions will be strong enough that they'll be able to spend their time not just in bargaining about wages, but in moving into the whole field of housing for their members and into consumer cooperatives and into credit unions. I look forward to the time when more and more we will organize people in the slum areas to help them improve the quality of life in their own area. I look forward to the time when in many industries, as is happening today already in Israel and in Yugoslavia, that the workers themselves will have part ownership in the industries and participate in the management of the industry. That's democracy. I come tonight to thank you. To thank you for what you have done to help this Social Democratic Party grow from strength to strength. I come to ask you to dedicate yourself to see that it keeps on growing from strength to strength. And I believe that it will grow, that the day will come in this country when we will build a society in which social justice and economic equity and human brotherhood will cover this earth as the waters now cover the sea. If it doesn't come in your time and my time, it will come in the time of those who come after us. I urge you tonight to continue to work and to continue to sacrifice to the end that someday, much sooner than you think, our dreams will come true. And the kind of society we cherish will be established in the hearts of men and in this country of ours, so that around the earth the principles upon which our movement was built will grow and grow toward the perfect day. Thank you.
Now we're going to hear Tommy Douglas reading A Man's a Man for A' That. He always considered this poem a summing up of Robert Burns' concern for freedom. He calls it the Charter of Democracy for the Common Man. He says it's done more than any other piece of literature to speak out for the rights of ordinary people. Tommy Douglas makes it his own.
Is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that. For all that and all that, our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man the gout for all that. What though on hamely fare we dine, wear hodden grey and all that? Ye fools their silks and knaves their wine, a man's a man
for all that. For all that and all that, their tinsel show and all that. An honest man, though e'er sae poor, is king o' men for all that. You see yon Bertie called a lord, was struts and stairs and all that. Though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coot for all that. For all that and all that, his ribbon star and all that. The man o' independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that. A king can make a belted knight, the marquis, duke, and all that. But an honest man's aboon his might, get faith he money for that. For all that and all that, their dignities and all that, the pith o' sense and the pride o' what, are higher rank than all that. Then let us pray that come it may, as come it well for all that sense and worth o'er all the earth may bear the grief for all that. For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that. That man to man, the world hour, shall brothers be for all that.